Dan Grunfeld is a former professional basketball player, an accomplished writer, and a proud graduate of Stanford University. An academic All-American and All-Conference basketball selection at Stanford, Dan played professionally for 8 seasons in top leagues around the world, including Germany, Spain, and Israel. Dan's writing has been published more than 40 times in media outlets such as Sports Illustrated, the Jerusalem Post, and NBC News. Dan earned his MBA from the Stanford Graduate School of Business in 2017 and lives with his wife and son in the Bay Area, where he works in venture capital. Dan, thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's a pleasure to have you.
Hi, Har. It's great to be here. Thanks to everyone for coming. Har, thanks to you so much for moderating. As you said, we've been, friends for so long. We're lifelong friends, so this is a real treat.
Absolutely. So for those of the guests in the audience that are not very familiar yet, tell them about the book. What is this really about?
Yeah, so many people know my dad, Ernie Grunfeld, from the world of professional sports, right? So he was a longtime NBA basketball player, longtime NBA executive. He was a high school basketball legend, college basketball legend. So that part of the story is fairly well known, but what's not well known is that he's the only player in NBA history whose parents survived the Holocaust. And so I did a 1.5 years of research for my book. And so the research actually suggests he's the only player in the history of the 4 major American sports leagues whose parents survived the Holocaust. And so it's kind of this unknown history. And I always grew up, when we were kids, running around in northern New Jersey, I still had a sense of the profound impact that basketball had on my family. I'm so close with my grandmother, who you know well, and you've eaten her delicious food, which I'm sure we'll talk a lot about. But we've always been so close, and kids are intuitive and perceptive, so I always kind of had a sense that something had happened and that her family was no longer with us. And so, then knowing, my dad coming to America as an immigrant, discovering the game of basketball, and then where it took our family, as I got older and as I started to learn that story even more, it became my dream to tell it.
Dan, I love it, and so beyond interesting. So let me ask you this. In your personal journey of writing this book, from the start date or estimated start date of when you knew this was something you were very passionate about, to the day of publishing and providing all the promotion around it to educate all those on such an important story in your life, northern New Jersey to Wisconsin, finishing up high school, out to Stanford, around the world, at what point did you really feel this was something so meaningful that you wanted to make sure you could share with the world?
Yeah, so when I retired from my professional career and I went to business school at Stanford to get my MBA, it was really the first time that I wasn't, all focused on basketball, and I had time to explore other interests, other options. And I had done a lot of writing, as you mentioned. I wrote for several websites, and my work had been published a lot, and I just love to storytell. And this has always been the big one, and I knew that, and I remember even talking about when I was playing, like, wow, wouldn't that be something if I could tell this story? And then when I got to business school and I had a little bit of space, I looked at my wife, Sam, who you know well, and one day I just said, you know what, if I'm ever going to do it, the time is now. And I also said to her, but if I'm going to do it, I have to approach it like I approached basketball, which was that I didn't just fit basketball into my schedule. And that, like, my schedule fit around basketball, and so this story was so big that I knew it had to be that way. And so when I was in business school, started doing the research, 1.5 years, interviewing my grandmother, my dad, family and friends from around the world, different historical sources. And once I had the research done, it took me 8 months to write my first draft. I woke up at 6:02 a.m. every day to write my first draft. And people ask me, why not 6 o'clock? I said, well, why not 6:04? It was early enough, and my alarm was set. And, and so when I was done with my first draft, Sam, my wife, she told me how proud of me she was, which of course I appreciated, but I told her, really the only thing I did is that I had the discipline to get out of bed every single morning, and I had that from basketball, and so that's kind of how the process went. And, as I got deeper and deeper into the history, man, it just became more apparent how important it was for me and my family to tell it, but I also thought it was kind of a relatable, universal story that people could believe in.
Unbelievable. And Dan, regarding your grandmother and the time you spent with her, all of our trips our families have ever taken, summers in Aspen, my older brother was in Madison, Wisconsin when you were living there, finishing up your high school career in Nicolay, a lot of time spent together where we had the privilege to see how beautiful your grandmother is inside and out. Is there anything you felt you learned about her or from her when you were doing these emotional interviews on topics that are very difficult to talk about that you felt you didn't know before?
There were, I mean, there were certainly a lot of details, because I asked questions that I never would have asked if I hadn't been doing research for a book. And my grandma and I, when I was at school, my grandma lives in the Bay Area. Still, by the way, everyone should know, 96 years old, doing amazing, still cooking amazing meals. I tell people, and Harrison can confirm this, you do want to eat her cooking. You do not want to play cards against her. Right, Harry? You've done both. And she's an amazing card player. She's very serious. She's also the best cook in the world. But she's doing so well. We've always been so close. I remember when I was at Stanford eating dinner at her house with a notebook and just asking her questions. And so I always cared about the story, but I never went as deep as I did for this. I was writing a book. And so, listen, my grandmother was saved twice by Swedish diplomat Raoul Wallenberg in Budapest. She was in the Budapest ghetto. She lost 5 siblings, and both parents in the Holocaust. So she has a really big story. And to understand the details of not only what happened to her, but what happened to her siblings, what happened to her parents, there was a lot I learned. I had no idea that a great aunt of mine, the only family member who came back from Auschwitz, was evaluated by Dr. Mengele, who's this notorious Nazi throughout history. I never knew that detail until it kind of surfaced through these interviews. And, and just learning about those things. Yeah, it's an experience that I'll never forget, of course, and now we have it in the book, but I don't think I would have been able to go to that depth of detail without writing the book, without asking those questions. And not only about the Holocaust, my family, after the war, they spent more than a decade under communism in Romania, and so it wasn't like it got easier, but it didn't get easy by any stretch of the imagination. And they fled communism as refugees, and they had passports for Israel, but ended up in the United States. And as you know, Harry, my dad, an older brother, and he was my dad's hero. And he was diagnosed with leukemia almost immediately upon arrival in the United States, and he passed away within a year. So that's another tragedy, and probably the biggest tragedy in my family. And to talk about that, to learn details about that, it was very hard, and there were definitely tears shed. But you have to know your history, so I'm so grateful that we undertook this project, because I was able to learn so many of those details.
The legacy is so important, and the awareness of it at such a level of depth, it can only make you stronger.
Yeah, it's true.
On 2 quick side notes, I would like to confirm to the audience that I have had Dan's grandmother's cooking. The food is so delicious. I only wish I had my gout medication back then when it occurred. Number one. Number two, every single night during one summer, I had the good fortune of spending some time in Palo Alto with Dan, where we were staying at unused apartment. And we would be so exhausted from workouts during the day of our training together. And she would be out playing cards in her card game, socializing. She'd come back in, and Dan would give her a hug and kiss. He'd say, "Anya, how'd it go?" And she'd have this smile on her face, and she'd say, "I won." Every night, I won. So I felt bad for that crew. But on a separate note, I would like to make sure we're accommodating the audience. There is one question that has just come in. The person who unfortunately will have to leave by 7 p.m. So I just want to make sure their question, Dan, gets asked.
Let's do it.
The question is, how is the book currently being promoted, and what responses are you getting from the non-Jewish community?
Great questions. Thank you for that. And by the way, anyone who has anything, please drop it in the chat. This is a very flexible conversation. So really appreciate it. On the promotion side, I'm very grateful that the story has resonated. And so last week, was International Holocaust Remembrance Day on Thursday. I was on Good Morning America. I was on the NBA on TNT. I was on Fox 5 News in New York. And, people are interested in this story, and particularly how it can shine a light on the events of the Holocaust. And so, just talking to a lot of folks, whether it's, television or media, and doing events like this. And this is some of my favorite stuff, to be able to talk to a dear friend, to, the Jewish community, to congregate, on a call like this it's just wonderful. And again, the response to the book has been incredible. So just so grateful for all of that. To your question about the response from the non-Jewish community, yeah, it's been wonderful. It really has. And I've had so many people I know who are not Jewish, people I don't know who are not Jewish, who have reached out to me because they read the book, and it opened their eyes, it shifted their perspectives. We talk about the Holocaust, but also my experiences, with anti-Semitism growing up, just carrying that history with you. And so I'm very proud of the book for that reason, to be able to shine a light on this history, certainly for Jewish people, but for non-Jewish people as well. And I just can't tell you how overwhelmed I've been with the response. I mean, the book has been out for roughly 2 months, and we're doing an emergency second printing now to get more copies in circulation, which is really awesome. So for all those reasons, I'm very, very grateful and very proud to be able to share the story.
You write in your book, Dan, as far as the non-Jewish community, how you've experienced anti-Semitism in America. This is decades after your family fled from it. It could have been when we were in northern New Jersey. It could have been when you were at Nicolet in Wisconsin. It could have been at Stanford, or even playing professionally in Germany, I would imagine. How did that affect you, and how did you deal with it?
Listen, I think, and I write in the book, even if it's not apparent to the naked eye, anti-Semitism is always there, and we know that as Jewish people. Whether it's a remark here, or a joke here, or an explicit statement or symbol, and so I certainly felt that. And when we were growing up here, I don't even know if you know this, but it was in the book that I was playing baseball with friends at a field in my hometown of Franklin Lakes, and there was a little blue shed that held the baseball equipment at this little playground, and we opened it up, and there was a big white swastika painted on the inside, and I froze, because I know that symbol, I know what it means. And so that was such an explicit example of it. But I was called Jew boy, and I was heard people tell jokes, and look what's happening in our society today. I mean, we saw what happened in Texas last week in Colleyville, the Whoopi Goldberg comments, the mouse book banning in Tennessee. It's almost like every day there's an act of anti-Semitism, of kind of Holocaust insensitivity, misinformation. And so these winds are still very much blowing, and it's a part of life. And listen, I get asked a lot since the book came out, like, what advice would you give younger people who are dealing with the same things? I say, listen, be proud of who you are, and where you come from, and also be close to your community. Like, as Jews, right, we have a very tight-knit community for a reason. We need each other. We need to stick together. And so, yeah, be proud of who you are, stay close to your community, also be an ally for others, because, and my story illustrates this, of course, the events of the Holocaust illustrates this. There was a point in time where we needed voices, and there weren't enough of them, and we all saw what happened. And so whenever there are people who are not being treated fairly, or there's injustice or inequality, we as Jews need to stand up against that, because it's not just us who needs that support, others do as well. And so that's kind of how you try to cope, you try to make sense of some of these things that are happening in the world.
I thought the appearance on Good Morning America was wonderful. Dan, I thought the NBA on TNT, listening to Charles Barkley and Kenny Smith discuss your interview, and how social injustice to people in general, not being dividing to any specific target demographic, but focusing on the importance of the Holocaust, and that this happens. Although it was somewhat comical hearing Shaquille O'Neal speak Hebrew, that was very funny. But yeah, I thought it was unbelievable. These gentlemen that have known your family for decades, essentially, that are just learning about this experience and they're sharing their views on it, how would you go ahead if you were giving a public speaking engagement to a completely diverse crowd after hearing their views on it, on the importance of this and how you could relate it to not just the Holocaust, but how people get themselves into these situations where they are in these constant uphill battles?
Yeah, and so to your point, I mean, for me to watch this NBA on TNT segment and to hear like Shaquille O'Neal and Charles Barkley talking about the Holocaust in relation to my family story was just an incredible thrill, and it just shows you the power of the platform and of basketball, and that shined a light on the Holocaust for so many people, and so a great thrill for me. You know, Shaq talked about living in West Germany, visiting Dachau, you know, and that's something that has such a lasting impact. And I think when you talk to groups, and I do, of you know, diverse people with different backgrounds, different challenges, I think the core remains the same. It's that we need to treat each other with respect and kindness, and people deserve to be treated fairly. And that's a notion that people can get behind, and particularly communities who have unfortunately experienced challenges, you know, and injustices. And there are many of them. It's not just the Jewish community. So there is a sense of kinship when you come from a community who has dealt with those challenges. And so, yeah, our story is, you know, it's a Jewish story in many ways, but it kind of transcends that, because we all know what it's like not to be treated the way you want to be treated, and how important it is to be a force for good in the world. And so I think that's, you know, something that this book, you know, a lesson it can teach.
Absolutely. And Dan, one of the biggest pieces of that, direct from the book, the correlation and the chronological order of how incredible your grandmother's story was to then your father's career and how you have incredible parents that raised you and your sister. Now you have an incredible wife and you've started your own family. How do you want to pass these values onto your own children?
Well, you know, listen, this is a big part of it, right? The book's right here, and these stories are their stories too. And so for them to know the history, to internalize it, you know, that's such a big part of it. And yeah, you know, I read in the book like the values that my grandmother learned from her father were then passed down to my dad, then passed down to me, and they'll be passed down to my kids. And that's what legacy and history is all about. And you know, my grandmother looked up to her father so much, and he was killed in Auschwitz, and he's such a, you know, formative part of our family and those values. And his name was Solomon Samuel, you know, and my son's name is Solomon, right? So my son carries the name of the person where really these values originated, you know. So, and again, this is all in the book, and it just tells that story of the passing down of values and history and legacy. And you know, it's very, you know, Jewish people, right? This is about family, right? Family oriented people. And for me, the vehicle is basketball, because that's what, you know, kind of saved my family. You know, my dad, again, coming as an immigrant who didn't speak English, who was made fun of. His brother passes away, you know, goes to the park in New York City to make friends, learn English, and heal from that loss. Roughly 10 years later, he's standing on top of the Olympic podium as a gold medalist for the United States. Right. And so again, I'll hold up my book, like, by the grace of the game. It's the only way it could happen, that from that background, you could, you know, get to be an Olympic gold medalist. And my grandparents, who are Holocaust survivors, got to be in Montreal and watch their son become a gold medalist for the United States. And so, you know, those stories, that history, those are the things that we hold with us and we pass down. And so I can do it through this book, which of course I will. But you know, just also do it on a day-to-day basis, how the values you impart, the way you raise your kids, what I've learned from subsequent generations, when I'll pass down to future generations.
Knowing where your grandparents came from and to have that moment to see your father at the top of the Olympic podium in Montreal, the emotions, the feelings, it's unimaginable what must have been going through their mind versus where they started to where they were. Does your father ever share with you specific values that his parents raised him with, that really instilled in him, that you can remember growing up, that then really motivated you to break through new thresholds at each level of your own career?
I do. So first and foremost, it was really about hard work, and that was something that my grandparents always talked about with him. And they didn't only talk about it, they modeled it. They came to America, they didn't speak English, they didn't have educations, because the Holocaust prevented that. And they built a really nice life through hard work. And my grandfather always used to tell my dad, if you work hard, good things will happen. That's it. You don't have to think much more about it. Just work hard and good things will happen. And so my dad applied that to his basketball career. And I grew up hearing that, and so that's, I was the same way. And you know that, right, Harry? I was very, maniacal about trying to, be a good basketball player. And I'm very honest about this in the book. Had my challenges as well. It's good to push yourself, but sometimes you could push yourself a little too hard, and trying to figure out what that right balance was. But definitely rooted in hard work. And then I'd also say fairness. And my dad was very much like that as an executive, right? He was an NBA general manager for 30 years. And he would always tell me just about being fair, just treating people the right way. And I think if you read the book and you understand his background, not only being the child of Holocaust survivors and growing up under communism, but coming to America as an immigrant who was made fun of. And it really matters to him to treat people fairly, because our family hasn't had that luxury in so many different ways throughout history. So for me, yeah, those values are work really hard and treat people the right way.
Absolutely, and great advice to pass on to others out there that can really relate to the story. Dan, if you don't mind, let's take another question from the audience.
Yeah, please.
Our next question is, what drove your grandparents to stay in Hungary after the war rather than emigrating to the United States or Israel?
It's a great question. They're actually in Romania, but they're on the border of Romania and Hungary. So the food is Hungarian, the language is Hungarian. And then I've been asked this question. I didn't quite know it. And I had to really dig with my grandma. And they started a family. They had my uncle, who I mentioned passed away. They had him not long after they got back from the war. And so they had a family. This is the place they knew. And so they just kind of started their lives. And an interesting tidbit to share, because people have asked me, my grandfather was in a forced labor camp in Hungary. My grandmother was in the Budapest ghetto. How did they meet? Where did they meet? And so my grandparents met the day my grandmother got back from surviving the Holocaust. When she got home, one of her older brothers she found, who was home, and he was alive. And my grandma had no clothes. All she had was a thin cotton dress and the blue overcoat that she wore during the frigid winter months in Budapest. And my great uncle said, "We need to get you some clothes." I made a friend in our forced labor camp. He just opened up a store nearby where they have clothes. Let's go get you some stuff. And it was that day that my grandmother walked through the doors of my grandfather's clothing store. So they literally met the day she got back. They were married very quickly after. And my grandma has told me that after what happened, starting a family was all people were thinking about. You wanted to rebuild, and so finding someone, listen, and then I write this very explicitly in the book. My grandmother grew up in a happy home. There were 10 of them, 2 loving parents, and she still to this day talks about the love and the laughter and the noise. She got back to a home where the sound echoed off the walls. No one was there, and the house was looted. It's a crushing history, right? So, but to be back and to have an opportunity to build a family of your own, there was no time to waste. And so my grandparents certainly were that way. They got married very quickly. They had their first child, and then they were under communism for a long time until they were able to leave.
Thank you very, very much for sharing, and incredibly powerful. Well, the next question that I have personally, Dan, when you think about life coming full circle, your family's back around, your father's career onto your career. Of all the basketball accolades you ever earned and worked for, I always think, watching your career from the sidelines, of how incredible the experience must have been wearing a Team USA uniform at the International Maccabi Games, and not only wearing that uniform, but being the most valuable player of the tournament and winning a gold medal with Bruce Pearl as your coach. Tell us about that experience and what that was like all these years after your family's history and having that honor.
Yeah, incredible. And so my dad played in the Maccabee Games in 1973 when he was a senior in high school. They won the silver medal. And as Harrison mentioned, I played in 2009 where I won a gold medal. So I always tease my dad, he has an Olympic gold medal, but I have a Maccabee Games gold medal. So we talk about that a lot in my family. But it was a life-changing experience. It was the first time I had been to Israel, and I mentioned my family had passports to go to Israel, and they spent 6 months in Rome before they were, after fleeing Romania, and they ended up coming to the United States at the last minute. But the majority of my family settled in Israel, and it was really Israel who opened up its arms to Holocaust survivors after the war. And so Israel was there to protect and preserve the Jewish people then, and it's there now for the same purpose. And just like we needed it then, we need it now too. And so 2009 was the first time I'd been there, and my sister Becky was there, my parents were there, and yeah, it was life-changing to really connect with the land of Israel, to learn about the history. The athletic accomplishment was very nice. We won and I was MVP, and that was all great, but it was bigger than that, because it was spiritual. And I remember saying to my sister, I'm going to finish my career here. I had a year left on my contract in Spain, and I did. That's exactly what I did. I finished out in Spain, played my last 4 years in Israel, 2 in Herzliya, 2 in Jerusalem. And so, my dad, being the only player whose parents survived the Holocaust, he won number 18 for the New York Knicks. And New York has the second largest Jewish population in the world outside of Israel. My dad wore number 18, which, in Judaism is a symbolic number, high to life. And so that's what my dad did. I played for the team in Jerusalem, right? So I had Jerusalem across my chest. So for our family, where we came from, what basketball did for us, it was such a full circle moment, and such a meaningful one. And another thing I'll touch on, and Harry, you visited me in Germany my rookie year, you visited me in Spain, but I write in my book, I'm likely the only professional basketball player who had to call his grandmother to ask permission to sign his first contract because it was in Germany. So when my agent called me and said, I got a great opportunity for you, and I was excited, I said, okay, where? And he said, first league in Germany. I said, okay, hold on, I need to call my grandma. And when I called her and I told her, and I said, I thought you might have a problem with that. And she said, well, what's the problem? And I told her, of course, we all know what happened. I'll never forget what she said to me. She said, sons are not responsible for the sins of their fathers, which is such an amazing kind of commentary on perspective. She said, you can't blame this generation for what that generation did. It's not this generation's fault. And that's what people have done throughout history to Jews. They've blamed us for things. And so you can't do that to others. And so she gave me her blessing. I went to Germany. I had a great experience there. And so that was still a big part of the story of Germany and Israel, right? And that's why, again, by the grace of the game, basketball, it gave us so much, and it connected so much. And so that's why, the story really does come full circle.
Absolutely. Dan, let's take another question from the crowd. We have, can you please tell us about your experience visiting Yad Vashem?
Yeah, emotional, very affecting. I visited Yad Vashem a few times when I was playing in Israel, and I visited the museum here in the States as well. And it's always a very somber way to spend a day. And for me, knowing what happened, and I write in the book about visiting the Holocaust Museum in DC, but I kind of, they're almost analogs because they both kind of tell this same history. Very emotional, but very important. You have to look at the pictures, you have to read the placards. I'm usually pretty quiet. We went as a team when I was in Israel, and there wasn't a lot of talking. There's just a lot of thinking and reflecting. And Yad Vashem, it has to be there. It has to tell this story. I always tell people when they go to Israel, visit Yad Vashem. You need to engage. I know the room with all the candles or the lights. I mean, I can still remember walking through it, and yeah, it's a very powerful experience.
When we were growing up, Dan, I can vividly remember two of the players amongst others that you might have looked up to or modeled your game after were Allen Houston on the Knicks and Ray Allen when he was on the Milwaukee Bucks. All of these years later, when you were in New York Knicks mini camp, Allen Houston was in the mini camp giving it one last go. All these years later, Ray Allen is writing the foreword for this unbelievable book. What was it like to have this type of discussion with Ray Allen, someone you look up to, worked out with, really experienced some special time with that most people wouldn't have? What was it like having this type of discussion with him and his passion and wanting to learn about the Holocaust?
Yeah, it was incredible. And, just because I modeled my game after those two guys doesn't mean I exactly, replicated their games. Those guys are both incredible basketball players. But I'm lucky to know Ray because my dad was the general manager of the Bucks when Ray was, the star shooting guard of the team, and I was a shooting guard. And as you said, he was always very good to me, took me under his wing at certain times, gave me pointers about my game. And so I just looked up to him so much. I didn't know that the Holocaust education, Holocaust remembrance was already a passion of his. He saw Schindler's List in college and he was so moved. And he said, this isn't just a Jewish tragedy, this is a human tragedy. And so it became his mission to educate people on the Holocaust. So every time his teams played in DC, he would take teammates to the museum. And I wasn't aware of that at the time. And he wasn't aware of my dad's background. He came to our house and they spent, a lot of time together. But my dad doesn't talk much publicly and even privately about this background. And so Ray didn't know. And when we connected many years later and, told him about the story, told him about the book and kind of asked for his support, he didn't hesitate. And he wrote such a moving forward for the book. And so for him to stand by it, it just shows what allyship looks like. And I say that, as much as I looked up to him as an up and coming high school basketball player, I look up to him more now as an adult, right? For the type of human being he is.
Absolutely. And Dan, I can only imagine the honor and just how appreciative your family must have been and your grandmother when he agreed to write the foreword and did a phenomenal job. It was so beautifully written, and I'm sure anyone who's read it so far has absolutely seen that. Another question from the audience. As you were sharing your own experiences, having dealt with anti-Semitism with your grandmother during the interview process to write this book, how did she react knowing that you were experiencing these things so many years after what she had been through?
Yeah, it saddens her, but it doesn't surprise her. And I'm not going to say that she has come to expect it, but she knows how the world works and she knows the unfortunate reality of the world we live in. And so it always saddens her. And when there's, a public incident like the hostage situation in Texas recently, and it's deeply upsetting to me for sure, but also to her. And to know that, yeah, her grandkids have to experience, anti-Semitism all these years after what she went through, it's hurtful. Again, it's saddening, but it also shows her and me the importance of sharing these stories. And she's always said that to me, if we don't tell these stories, no one else will. And it could happen again, and not just to Jewish people, to any people, so whenever it almost emboldens her a little bit to talk about it. She's so proud of me and my book because it's spreading these stories, and that's a big part of it, is not to just sit back, but to, again, be proud of who you are and to be a force for good. And so, yeah, it's the hard truth about the world we live in, but we can do our part, which is to be proud of who we are, to be allies for others, and to tell our stories. And that's what I tried to do with my book.
Dan, it's unbelievable the methodology of passing these messages on, not just via the book as you're mentioning, but your grandmother's stories, making sure it's communicated effectively and making sure that this really, really gets sent through the proper channels. One question that I found very interesting that has just popped in is your son Solomon, my daughter, other young children, they unfortunately will not have the privilege of growing up in a world filled with survivors of the Holocaust. Outside of your book being published and having a real authentic need to educate and raise our children with strong Jewish values and a strong Jewish identity, letting them know that this has happened and how important it is to be raised viewing the world through the proper lens. How do you plan on doing that with your own son or to other young parents?
Yeah, I think, again, like, they have to know their history, they have to know where they come from, who they are, and you model the behavior. And I saw that in my family growing up, and I write this in the book. Like, we weren't the most religious family, but culturally being Jewish mattered so much. And I still remember the Hanukkahs and the Passover Seders and the Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, all the holidays that we really took seriously. And I think just living those values, speaking about this history, and at the appropriate time, because there are some details that are hard, but I think you have to gauge that as a parent. But yeah, I plan on just being very honest with my kids and being very forthcoming, and it's a necessity. You have to know where you come from. You have to know what the Jewish people have been through. You also have to know what other people have been through. So to be a well-informed, well-educated member of our society is so important, and I'm going to do everything that I can do, to make sure my kids are.
Let me ask you this: leaving Stanford, having a successful career there, if my memory serves me correctly, Dan Onion never missed a home game. She was at every game, supporting you, being there. I can vividly remember, and how fortunate to go to college. Most people go away from home and they're starting new, building a new foundation at college, and being a student athlete has its challenges. What a blessing to have your grandmother down the street from the university. She never misses a home game cheering you on. It's unbelievable to have that level of support and that meaningful of a relationship that will last you forever with all the memories you've created. To then go to Germany with the story you shared, then to Spain, to meet your beautiful wife along the way, and spend several years together as a married couple and a partnership in Israel. Did the time in Israel really set a foundation for Jewish values that maybe we weren't exposed to growing up in the United States?
Yeah, I think definitely. I mean, we experienced Shabbat dinners every Friday. There, and that was something that I didn't do as much. Now that I'd never done it, but it's the way life is structured in Israel, and we love that. And when I was playing basketball before I got to Israel, I didn't fast on Yom Kippur. I was playing, and I was just so focused on that. And then I fasted my first year in Israel, and I've fasted every year since. Just because being there and understanding what that holiday really means. And so it did kind of root us even more deeply. And listen, I played for Jerusalem. I lived 15-20 minutes from the old city. So to press my hands on that wall and to know that Jews from around the world have been doing that for centuries it's such a powerful experience. So yeah, in many ways it did. And yeah, again, we have so much family there. And you mentioned my grandmother coming to every home game I played. If she were on the call right now, she'd also say, and some road games, which is true. She, Cal, USC, UCLA. She traveled too. She also came to my dorm every Sunday to drop off my clean laundry, pick up my dirty laundry. You know this stuff. So I was treated very well and still am by my grandma. But yeah, to live that life and to know that that's where the majority of our family ended up. I was able to reconnect with cousins, some of my dad's first cousins who they were in Israel, and so for all those reasons, those points of connection were so deep. And my wife and Sam and I both, like, we still cherish those times.
Dan, a little bit of a comical question from the audience.
Please.
What was the basketball coaching staff at Stanford utilizing your grandmother in the recruiting pitch when you were in high school, Nike Derby, All-American Classic? You had your handpick of wherever you wanted to go. Was that part of the pitch?
That's a great question. So, and so in the book I talk about, I wanted to go to Stanford since I was in 7th grade. And so Stanford was not something that happened by accident. And a big part was because my grandmother lived there. It was also a great program, great school. And I really made that my goal. And through a combination of luck, a little skill, a little great timing, I got there. And so I actually, and you'll read this in the book, I had to sell them more than they had to sell me, actually, because I was all in. But I'll tell you, like, they were recruiting me, and which was a dream in and of itself, to be, because at Stanford was a top 5 program, and it's where I wanted to go. And then they were recruiting me, and I was one of their top recruits, and I was like, oh my God, this actually could happen. But they hadn't offered me a scholarship, and it was towards the end of the summer. And I remember being on the phone with my dad and kind of telling him, like, I'm close, but I'm not sure if I'm going to make it. And we had one more tournament I had one more to prove it to them. And this was to be near my grandma. This is to continue the legacy. And in the first game of that tournament, I scored 45 points. Stanford staff was sitting right in the front row to watch me, and I had 45 points. And so I'll hold up my book again, by the grace of the game. And there's always been something spiritual and kind of cosmic about how this story has gone, and that's part of it. There was something in the universe that was rooting for me and my grandmother and the family, and for it all to kind of come together. And so, yeah, that's all to say that Stanford didn't have to sell me as much as I had to sell them, but we got it done.
I love it. And I'm sure the audience has to appreciate the roller coaster that life is in general, and how you really responded to all the challenges and pursued the endeavors. And it just makes me think, for anyone reading this book, regardless of background, sports, not sports related, is there one larger message you would like to pass along to anyone out there?
So what I'll say is that there's a lot of darkness in this story, the Holocaust and these other issues, but there's a lot more light, and ultimately this is a hopeful and happy story. I drew so much inspiration from this story throughout my life, and it allowed me to dream big, to set my eyes on Stanford. And because I grew up with people who had been through so much and had overcome so much that, to me, nothing was impossible. And I think much of the success I've had is just because of that, and so I hope when people read this book, they get that same feeling of hope and inspiration from the story. Because while there are difficult things, it's really a story of love. And so, yeah, I hope that's what people get when they read it.
Sounds terrific. I'm sure that is the case. And so many wonderful things in front of you as the book becomes more and more just visible to so many out there. Could you fill us in on the next 30 to 60 days? What does the schedule look like regarding speaking engagements, different Zoom events, things you're doing to raise awareness of the story?
Yeah, just engaging with groups. I love connecting with communities like this one that are very near and dear to me, as a Jewish American. And so, just talking to groups, doing media. I mentioned, of course, the big media that I did last week, but it doesn't stop. I'm doing podcasts and print interviews, and I have a book website, which is just my name, dangrunfeld.com. And so we list all the events and yeah, again, I'm blown away by the response and the amount of people who care about the story and want to learn more. And I'm not going to pass up an opportunity to talk about my family story. This is not a commercial endeavor for me. This is from the heart. This is like, this is my family story. This is essentially my soul on the page of a book, right? So I'll never not take an opportunity to try to share this story. And I'm grateful for you all on the call for listening, hopefully for spreading the word, and buying the book for yourself or someone you love. One cool thing about the book has been I've had grandparents and parents say, I need to buy this for my kids and grandkids, and I've had kids and grandkids say, I need to buy this for my parents and grandparents. So I think it kind of is, it crosses those boundaries a little bit. So for all those reasons, and I'm just talking to people about the book, and I'm just so grateful for doing that.
Dan, the response has clearly been wonderful, and we appreciate you making the time so much this evening. I'd like to make sure we open it up and leave plenty of time. If anyone has any questions they would like to put into the chat, we would be more than happy to answer. We are well within the time constraints of the event. Please feel free to throw them in, and Dan would be more than happy to answer them.
We actually have a question that didn't come through on the chat, but through the Q&A. Joshua Gelnick, who's actually the co-chair of YLA, asked, how do you plan to teach, oh, sorry, that is the one that you just, sorry, maybe you did see that one. Or maybe you just happened to also answer it another way. How do you plan to teach your son, who won't have the privilege to grow up in a world filled with survivors, the importance of Holocaust remembrance? So many people have that question, of course.
You know what? It was such a good question, Joshua. Let's answer it twice and ask it twice, because it is a great question. But no, listen, and so it's my kids, but it's also other people. I talked to students recently, and there was talk about like, okay, is this book part of the curriculum one day? And so for me, like, that's a dream. Like, wow, like school age children, maybe they're Jewish, maybe they're not, but would read a book that they'll enjoy and they'll laugh, because there's a lot of funny stuff and there's a lot about basketball, but they'll learn about the Holocaust and through my family story. And so, I already talked about what I plan to do with my kids, but just like expanding it, my hope is that I can help educate others people's kids in a way, and give them a medium that, yeah, again, is accessible, but is also educational.
Dan, we have another question that has come in. What is your favorite Hungarian food?
I was waiting for that one. Thank you for asking. So it's called rontatouche, which has eaten a lot. It's like bread and chicken. So you could liken it to schnitzel, but don't do that, because it's like whatever my grandmother does, she puts magic in it. It's like the core of so many different meals. So there's rontatouche, and then she'll make this amazing potato dishes and cabbage. I never knew I loved cabbage so much, but like there's all these amazing things you could do with cabbage. I tell people, like, my grandmother probably makes 30 soups, and they're all amazing, but they're soups that like you wouldn't think are amazing. So I would be in middle school or high school or even at work, because my grandmother, we live next to each other. So we'd eat at her house on a Sunday, and then I'd have leftovers all week. So I'd be at work and people would say, what are you eating? And I'd say, well, this is cabbage soup, or this is sour cherry soup, or, and they, oh, that sounds gross. I said, that's fine. You don't have to have any, no more for me. So I literally, the first things I write in the book are about my grandmother's food, and throughout the book. So a lot of times people will write me about the book and share their thanks and their appreciation, but they'll also say, God, that really made me hungry.
Dan, we are getting some very, very hungry Hungarian Jewish cooking questions now. So I mean, this is terrific. My mouth is watering. I'm ready to go. I'm definitely ready to go. So one of the audience members has been working on preparing a cookbook using recipes from survivors. Do you think your grandmother would ever be willing to share some of her special dishes?
Amazing project. Congratulations. Very important. And I hope you read my book, because I talk a lot about food and food as a vessel of love and history. So yes, the food happens to taste amazing, but it's more than that, because they're the dishes that my great grandmother made for my grandmother before she was killed in Auschwitz, and so to be able to memorialize the dishes that survivors have, that is a way to carry that history like it's been in my family. So amazing project. please reach out. You can find through my website, there's ways to connect. My grandmother, this is probably will not come as a surprise to you, does not cook with recipes, does not have any measurements. My wife has learned these dishes, but it's always a pinch of this and a pinch of that. But there are ways to try to quantify it. And so I'll be helpful in any way I can, because it's an important project. And certainly you'll read the book, you'll see one that I can really, really get behind.
Terrific. And Dan, the next question. There is so much perseverance and hope in your grandmother's story, as well as your father's and your own. Is there anything specific you attribute that to?
I mean, I think it's the example and the belief. Like I said, for me, my grandparents both survived the Holocaust, and my grandmother not only saved herself, she saved others. She risked her life to obtain passes from Wallenberg, extra passes for other people. And so I saw a hero and what she went through, and saw my dad overcome, the death of his brother and being an immigrant to achieve it. So again, I had that belief. And so when times got tough, for me, and I write about this in great detail in the book, I had this very traumatic injury at the worst time. And that was a really big setback and disappointment. But for me, looking around and seeing people who've overcome so much, it gave me the motivation to keep going. And I think I'm hoping you read this book, you'll feel that too, right? Because yes, it's my family, it's my grandma, my dad, but their stories are here. And that's the type of thing that gives you hope. For them, I just think, my grandmother has the will of a survivor. You'll see that. She's an incredible person. She has this amazing perspective. She's wise, she's smart and savvy, and she just had this will to survive. And for my dad as well, he just kind of had something inside him that pushed him. And so I think that there's the nature and the nurture part of it. And for me, I just learned so much from them, and I hope folks who read my book take that away too.
Absolutely. And Dan, thank you so much for sharing. As we start to wind down, are there any other questions that anyone from the audience would like to ask?
This has been great. And thank you for everyone's been so engaging and involved. I love questions, and it doesn't have to be the last time. So I already mentioned the book website, but all the social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, love to connect with people and just continue to share the story and engage in that way. So this doesn't have to be the last time. But also, Har, I want to thank you for doing this. I mean, we've had so many great conversations over the years, and this is literally just two of the oldest friends just talking in front of people. So love you, man, and just so grateful that you've done this.
Dan, I love you too. Please give tremendous hugs from my family to yours, especially your grandmother of all people. So glad to hear she's doing well, and best wishes with the rest of the book tour and the promotion. And we are so honored to have you, and just so thankful to just provide our support and continue spreading the word.
And
you got it.
No.
So real quick, I also just want to thank Jill and Barry from Yad Vashem USA as well for everything you've done to facilitate this, and your partnership has been amazing. So thank you, Jill, Barry, and everyone else. I know I'm likely forgetting folks, but everyone on the Yad Vashem side, thank you.